The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan presents us with a kind of paradox, or Zen koan. In a dramatic way, he demonstrates that the sexual relationship is impossible in two ways. First, the formulas Lacan gives for different sexes, man and woman, depend on the phallic rule, which is, for men, the obligation to be symbolically castrated in order to join the symbolic, defined by the big other who is not castrated, and for which is, for women, the partial refusal of this principle, meaning that those who would call themselves women could never be fully admitted to the relation defined by the phallic rule. In contrast to this negative situation, Lacan extends and reinforces Freud's idea that the other is always a sexuated other, the foundation of all desire and identification. In other words, there is not one aspect of the life of the subject that is not structured by the sexual relation, although this relation is defined as the impossible, the impossibility itself of the sexual relation. Our questions about extension, where, as Freud put it, psyche is extended, knows nothing of it, is automatically a sexuated extension. Lacan makes this perfectly clear in Seminar XIV, the structure of fantasy, when he presents his slide rule analogy, a demonstration of how the unary trait, the one, is structured by the Fibonacci number series, which could be characterized as a numerical form of metonymy and the logic of the signifying chain. If we look at Lacan's matheme of sexual difference, we see four positions, which I can interpret for you, starting at the upper line, that all those who would call themselves men obey the phallic law, the phi x, as long as there is one x who does not. On the next line, we have the rule of the woman. The woman, any woman, all women, do not fully buy into the phallic rule. And, to the right, we see the expression meaning that there are no exceptions to this. But the order of these positions move from a plus-plus condition on the upper left to a minus-minus situation on the lower right. This looks very familiar. It is what is called a standard polygon, the diagram that models what a torus and other projective figures work like. If we rotate the four expressions, we can use the same order Lacan uses when he gives his own toroidal diagram in Seminar XIV, relating repetition on the upper right corner to suppression on the lower left corner, and we can see how the negations in four positions mark the expansion at the plus-plus position and a subsequent contraction at the minus-minus position. The thing that is truly revolutionary here is that we have followed William J. Urban's project of connecting the sexuation mathemes to the four discourses and everything else, which Lacan has already presented in Seminar XIV as the relation of compulsion to the impossible real of suppression. From here, we can go on to think about metaphor and metonymy, so it's important to establish the relation to topology at the start of such projects. The first thing we might learn or try out is to see at the upper part of this standard topological diagram a relation between compulsion and the dysfunction we identify with the hysteric, namely a specifically feminine alienation. Let's say that the compulsion is about a one-to-one relation to a law that is imposed. Prudence is precisely this, the precise adherence to the letter of the law, which Lacan would rephrase as the law of the letter. This arrangement makes it rather obvious that the sexuation matheme agrees closely with the arrangement of the four discourses: university at the position of repetition on the upper right, the master's discourse beneath it, the hysteric diagonally across, and analysis at the position of closure. Ethnologically, we could say a lot about this, since it is the phase of culture called cyclopean, where religions localized the production of laws at the individual family hearth based on procedures of divination and was absolute. Hence Prometheus was bound to the rock. Whatever the local fire said about the future was to be an absolute rule. The position of the hysteric in Cyclopean culture is even more interesting, since the daughter, as one of those virgins who attended the sacred flame, were forbidden to abandon the hearth. The institution of marriage therefore obliged the bride to fake her willingness. Marriage was portrayed as abduction. The passivity of the bride was necessary to avoid the anger of the spirits embodied by the flame. So sanguine, in relation to prudence, was the masquerade that, in terms of Alcestis, was staged death followed by a rescue, like Orpheus's rescue of Eurydice, but more successful. The bride is by definition a hysteric, in the same way that any actress must be one part mask, one part skilled actor. The lower part of the matheme depends on the topological conversion of Euclidean space, which is characteristic of the upper half, into a kind of trap at the lower half, where as soon as one desires to escape, a trap springs into being. This as soon as effect is a kind of quantum factor that is localized, as when the two arrows are simply not reversed in projective space, but where the motion of one vector generates its own opposition at each and every point of its trajectory. We see metonymy operating in both of the vectors that spring from compulsive repetition at the upper right, because the slash between the contrasting pluses and minuses are the essence of metonymy. But when the vectors reconverge on the lower left, the minus, we have not only the position of the woman as not all, we have an image of the woman in this situation, the feminine composite, the sphinx, who as a monster both guards the gate of Thebes and poses the classic question, what does the woman want? This is the suppression that is the logic of the metaphor, put in terms of the sign as monster, a meaning suppressed by a replacement. There are many more associations that one could make from this adaptation of the sexuation matheme to the standard polygon of the torus, but I want to focus on the distinction of the upper region from the lower, in the same way that the upper seems to be about the act of speaking, while the lower is about the signifieds, the unconscious specifically, where there is no time and where space is a desire to flee that simultaneously generates its own trap. The topology of the master and the sphinx are evident in the ethnographical examples of both, where the idea of impasse and impossibility are in the foreground. As a diagram of heroes and hysterics on the upper half, and imprisoned masters and monsters on the lower, the role of exile can be seen as an axis with two control points. At the top, we see the classic hero at the midpoint of his trials, a successful point, but one that is the situation of the whole arc, that the hero is the one who is required to leave home. The other kind of exile happens in the self-constructed prison, where the master is frustrated by the logic of the master's discourse, which aims to destroy all those it needs for self-recognition. Self-destruction is also a theme with the sphinx, who must commit suicide as soon as her riddle is deciphered. In general terms, this is when Freud remembered the name Signorelli, but at the same time realized that the effect of suppressing it was the entire upper story of metonymic associations he made out of the name. As Lacan notes in Seminar XIV, Freud would not have noticed the relation that allowed him to replace Signorelli with Herr if he had not been a foreigner, that is, one who is in exile, a stranger in a strange land. Just as Freud was an exile in the upper half of the diagram, the word Herr was an exile in a prison made for shadows in the lower half. Repression is the focus of psychoanalysis, and hence analytical discourse, but the ethnological position puts us at the gates of Thebes, with Oedipus, figuring out how the riddle is related to the unconscious and why the riddle is also about containment of the city, a containment that needs to be undone. Because we can plot the arc connections at the upper half of the diagram using Freud's famous Signified parapraxis, we can see this trajectory from the university discourse that prudently maps signifiers in a one-to-one relation, the model of repetition. The university must keep the master signifier behind the scenes, and the relation of metaphor to suppression and the unconscious is clear, both in the discourse matheme for analysis and in the ethnological evidence of such gate-guarding monsters as the sphinx. But where the upper and lower halves seem to be about heroes and anti-heroes, and thus about the relation of speech as a series of acts in relation to a content that is always somewhat inaccessible, either as unconscious suppression or as a riddle posed by a monster, we have the same trajectory mythic narratives use to connect the sanguine position of the hero who must leave home, who will succeed, but who will necessarily overreach himself and die. This is a performative arc, appropriate to the space of the act once we translate the sexuation matheme into a map of the four discourses. What we find that is a bit surprising is how the diagram predicts that, just as the human infant is born before it is able to be a subject, the hero's death is also premature. The hero is not just dead. The hero enters into a space where it must wander before finding rest or reincarnation. This premature death is called the second death, the interval between the two deaths, where the momentum of the upper zone is reconfigured as a riddle space. Where the hero was separated above, he is alienated below, by the puzzled eternity of space and time, an eternity that comes in the form of a labyrinth. Our overlapping diagrams were getting complex, but at this point our patience pays off because we can rewrite the upper and lower spaces as the familiar matheme for the signifier over the signified, the big S over the little s, the signified. Now we see what Lacan meant by putting the little s under the bar, reversed to Saussure's order. The little s is suppressed by the signifier, the big S. And in ethnology, the wet line connecting the hot-wet sanguine with the cold-wet phlegmatic position is really also the meaning of the Lacanian distinction between the signifier and the signified. Only here we have a lot of narrative structures to explain why this is the case. Also, we now understand the small s signified in terms of the unknown factor, the x, that is like the x in the algebra equation. The x can never be particularly known. We know this when we go to any dictionary to look for what something means. We find one definition, which requires another, and then another, and another. Metaphor forces this suppression of the signifier that makes the repressed signifier into the meaning lying beneath all of the active metonymies we will encounter above the wet line. Now we have a better chance to understand Lacan's mysterious formula for metaphor, which I show at the top. Thanks to the standard polygon of the torus, we can see that the metaphor uses one signifier, which from the parapraxis story is what Freud sees that native Italians don't in the name Signorelli. This is what pushes the name underwater, what makes it inaccessible. This is Freud's traumatic encounter with the name as a cryptogram that encodes the meaning, the signified of the father, into it without saying why it does this. Freud doesn't know why Signorelli is a sir, a signor, a herr, a father. He doesn't know, and this is doubly repressed, first as a riddle relating to his own exile in the Adriatic lands, where he is reduced to a tourist, but also a trauma that is now material, belonging to the unconscious. This makes the metaphor formula into a two-part machine. As soon as the signor component is repressed, the metonymies that Freud encounters along his journey not only spring forth, but appear to be linked in an uncanny network of shifting relations. The X works like an X in an algebraic expression. It's an unknown that takes on any assigned value. It marks a position rather than a specific meaning. The as soon as component of this machine becomes, in the algebra expression, the way that the S as a denominator and S as metonymy above the X can cancel each other out. On the left, suppression. On the right, expression. The waterline comparison is appropriate because now we realize that suppression and expression are like hydraulics, where something pushed beneath the waterline makes something else pop up. The two cancelled out elements, however, tell us a lot about the relation of the performative hero to his shadow double below. Although mythic narrative puts this as a sequence, where the hero's lively actions above are followed by trials in the underworld, there is an equally powerful mythic theme that holds that each hero has a shadow double, and that while the living hero is defined by separation, the lower shadow is defined by alienation, an alienation specific to the suppression that is produced by trauma. That this signified, and every signified, has the status of the real, something that by definition resists being taken into the symbolic, is something we are reminded by Lacan's example of the rat man, that this resistance can take place inside the symbolic as well as outside. It is a case of extimacy. Acting out and the passage à l'acte are two sides of the same coin, and the diagonal connecting them are what I call an isomeric boundary, a boundary separating something from nothing. Lacan gives us a very specific projective figure for talking about how projectivity generally is a combination of non-orientation, which we see illustrated in the upper part of the form, which resembles a Mobius band, and self-intersection, which by itself creates continence or self-intersection, such as any circular boundary seems to enclose a territory. The cross-cap makes sure we see that incontinence is also a consequence of self-intersection, as irrational as that may seem. If we turn the cross-cap upside down, it is in the position of the standard reference polygon we have been using to compare mythic narrative to Lacan's four discourses, and to the four conditions defining sexuation. The dry line that connects the hero's position at the zenith of the hot, dry humors connects to the cold, dry position of melancholy, where we know both clinically and logically to be about incontinence and self-refutation. Even Aristotle recognized that melancholics were suicidal, a kind of empirical observation. But here there is a principle behind suicide, a dynamic stability maintained between life and death, construction and destruction. Once we see emergence as the force producing parapraxis in the form of metonymic chains of signifiers that all seem to relate to each other, thanks to some missing mysterious X element, the dry line between the hero of these metonymies, working in the reality time of the performative, and the anti-hero of melancholy are the same hero. The as soon as rule means that they are both the same when the relation is presented as a cycle, where death follows life, and as a rotation of two heroes, such as Castor and Pollux, or Romulus and Remus, each a perfect shadow of the other, one going down just as the other is emerging. This is such a widespread theme in ethnology that it is not necessary to argue the point. The shadow soul, and the relation between the emergent space of the active hero versus the topological space of Hades, are a model for how Euclid seems at first continent, but then is shown to be incontinent, and how the incontinence of projective topology seems to be incontinent, but thanks to self-intersection, is continent. We have one set of rules for how projection is something both mathematical and ethnological, logical and psychological, or rather psychoanalytical.